I want to share a presentation that I made on the history of desegregation in Oak Ridge. It was first given to the Oak Ridge High School seniors on September the 4th, 2020. I have made just a few revisions since then, and I'd like to bring this up to date and share that with you now. I began by talking about prehistory, as I always do when I make presentations. Point out because of a friend of mine that is descended from the Yuchi Indians. I promised to make people aware that the Uchis were the last ones in this area prior to the white settlers coming in. The Cherokee were to the south. And of course, there were valleys and ridges that provided shelter and good hunting. Streams provided the water. And then the white settlers began to arrive in the late 1700s, and they treated with the Cherokee for the land. Now, the Cherokee didn't think anybody could own the land, but in fact, the white settlers felt that they could. So they did that in a series of treaties. The first settlers claimed large parcels of the creek and the river bottom land. Of course, there's lots of ridges in this area as well, but the creek bottoms and the river bottoms were good land, and that's where they settled. In the 1800s and up actually to the Civil War period, there were large plantations in this area. They used slave labor. The African Burial Ground, which is near the East Tennessee Technology Parks Heritage Center, is good evidence to this era because about 100 graves have been located there. None of them are marked, some with just field stones. But that's where a large portion of the slave population was buried. There's also a small cemetery near the Gallagher family cemetery, and that's where the house slaves were buried. Now, by 1942, there were 1,000 farms in this area and 3,000 people living in the communities. It was fairly well isolated and self-supported. There were just a few general merchandise stores, a few schools, and a few churches, along with their graveyards. The small communities with churches and schools were Robertsville, Wheat, New Bethel, New Hope, and Scarborough are the primary ones. Elza really was not a community name, but merely a railroad siding, and it was constructed when the railroad tunnel was being dug beneath Black Oak Ridge in the 1920s. There was, in fact, one small community of African Americans located near where Cedar Hill Park is today at the top of Michigan Avenue and the corner of Outer Drive and Michigan Avenue. Woods Chapel was the name of the church there. This is a picture of what the little church looked like. Another view from the backside. And then here's the tombstone for Elijah Wood. He was a Civil War veteran with the Union colored heavy artillery. His tombstone is the only one in the cemetery, and it's located, as I mentioned, near the intersection of Michigan Avenue and Outer Drive. There were estimated approximately 20 graves there, according to the records for that cemetery. But this is the only grave marker that's there. Company K, USCH A on his tombstone, which stands for Company K, United States Colored Heavy Artillery. Now, African Americans were part of the workforce here during the Manhattan Project, but they were not treated the same as white people. You have to remember this was the segregated South at that time in the 1940s. They were not allowed to bring their children, and they were not allowed to live together as husband and wife. They were put in hutments, 16 by 16-foot plywood structures. And the women were separated from the men and actually put fences around the women's hutments and had a guard on the gate getting into it. This is what the hutments look like on the interior. This is a replica at the K-25 History Center where you can see what they actually look like. And note the stove that was in the center. The beds would have been along the walls. There's also a replica hutment at the Oak Ridge History Museum that you can see that will give you even better picture of what they look like. Tell you a story about one of the ladies, Katie Strickland. She decided that if she could get her husband to bring her a piece of metal out of the construction site at K-25. Now, they were down at Happy Valley, which is just across the road from the Highway 58 from K-25 construction site. 15,000 people were living there at the time during the construction. And Katie told her husband if he would bring her a piece of metal out of the construction site, she'd make her a biscuit pan and use that stove to bake biscuits. And then she would give it to the guard, give the biscuits to the guard. And that way the guard would let her husband stay with her longer. This is actually Katie's biscuit pan that she made. Katie's passed away now, and her family has donated the biscuit pan. It's on display at the K-25 Atomic History Center. Another interesting connection to Oak Ridge that never really happened is Jesse Ernest Wilkins Jr. He entered the University of Chicago at age 13, the youngest student ever admitted there. And there was talk about bringing him to Oak Ridge during the Manhattan Project. But the problem was that, like the rest of the South, uh, Oak Ridge abided by the Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation. They arose from a post-Civil War and post-Reconstruction ideology that promoted white supremacy and black subjugation as a way of life in the South, and likely would have prevented Wilkins from assuming a scientific post here. Now, that's taken from a historically speaking column in the Oak Ridger that we wrote about this particular subject. If he'd moved to Oak Ridge, he would not have been allowed to eat and chat with the white men he was supervising in the whites only cafeterias and the recreation halls. If he rode the bus anywhere in Oak Ridge, he'd been forced to ride in the back. So actually, I really believe that Ed Teller wrote a letter recommending that he not come to Oak Ridge, but that he stay in Chicago. And I believe Teller did that because he wanted him there to help him. At any rate, things began to change immediately after World War II ended with the dropping of the two atomic bombs. Gamble Valley was designated as a family housing area for African Americans. Children were allowed, families could live in the houses. Scarborough School, which had been formed in 1949, and Arizona officer had been hired by Alden Blankenship, who was the superintendent at the time, hired her to form a black school in the Scarborough School. down at where the Scarborough community was. That school had been built in the 1920s and it was still there, had been used during the Manhattan Project. But now that the war had ended, it was available. So they were, it was used to by Arizona officer as the principal for African American students. When Scarborough School moved to Gamble Valley, the students wanted to bring the name with them. And that name was Scarborough, which eventually became adopted by the entire community. And the community is now known as the Scarborough community. And then, of course, in 1954, there was the Brown versus the Board of Education ruling. And on September the 6th, 1955, the Scarborough 85 desegregated Oak Ridge High School and Robertsville Junior High School. Now, prior to that, Waldo Kahn, who was the chair of the Oak Ridge City Council, wrote a letter to Congressman Howard Baker, Senator Baker's father, saying there was a tempest in a teapot in Oak Ridge because he had favored the desegregation of Oak Ridge schools. He faced a recall vote, which failed. However, he did resign as chairman. He thought that he was bringing too much negative attention to the city council. But the desegregation proceeded with only minor resistance. This tempest in a teapot that he was talking to the congressman about didn't materialize as being much of a resistance. They threatened to boycott the schools, but actually did not. Yet it was still not an easy thing to accomplish. The people who experienced it personally know the details. Few talk about those details, but the accomplishment is really what's important. And yeah, there was difficulty in relationships in the school, but the the situation was handled really, really well. The principal of the high school had a lot to do with that, and he had he insisted that there not be any disruption in the schools, and it went very smooth. Tom Dunnigan was his name. Now, here's a story that happened in the 60s. Now, while Oak Ridge desegregated those two schools in 1955, desegregation for the rest of the town was not moving at a pace to equal what had happened in the schools. Now, the Reverend James Spicer tells in the Oak Ridge story that at beginning with the only town in America that was built and maintained by the federal government as a Jim Crow town. That was his comment. Jim Crow laws is the name given to certain laws in force from 1877 to 1960, and they were designed to maintain segregation, and they favored white supremacy. So desegregation in Oak Ridge was a struggle even after that landmark desegregation in 1955 of two schools. So Mayor Bob McNeese and Reverend James Spicer decided to go to Atlanta and meet with the Davis brothers. Now, the reason for that is they thought if they could get the Davis brothers cafeteria in Oak Ridge to desegregate, that would go a long ways toward influencing other organizations in Oak Ridge to desegregate as well. So they thought they'd just go to Atlanta, meet with the Davis brothers, and see if they could convince them to desegregate their cafeteria. Well, the meeting in Atlanta didn't go well. Both Davis brothers were adamant they were not about to desegregate their restaurants, and they actually escorted the mayor and the preacher out of their office. Now, the mayor was a little bit hot-headed and was very upset by the fact that the Davis brothers wouldn't listen to him and literally escorted them out of their office, kicked them out. That's the way he would have put it. So when they were on the airplane going back, one of them sat by a window seat, and then across from the on the other side of the airplane, the other one had a window seat over there. So there were some seats between the two of them, yet they were still talking back and forth about that meeting with the Davis brothers. Well, a well-dressed young man sat down between them, actually sat down by the preacher, and he overheard the conversation. And he asked the two of them, "Where are you from?" And they responded, "We're from Oak Ridge." So they finished their airplane ride, went back to Oak Ridge, and a few days later, Gene Joyce, who was a lawyer in Oak Ridge, called Reverend James Spicer to his office. And he told him the Davis brothers had agreed to desegregate not only the restaurant in Oak Ridge, but all of their restaurants across the South. Now, it was amazing to the preacher, and he wanted to know how that come about. And what had happened is the young man that had gotten on the airplane was Guilford Glazier, and he had called the Davis brothers and told them that if they would desegregate their restaurant in Oak Ridge, he would allow them to operate the bowling alley rent-free. And that contract was for $8,000, I believe, for the next 6 years, or 6,000 for the next 8 years. I forget which. But Guilford Glazier, owned the shopping center in Oak Ridge, and he owned that cafeteria and the bowling alley. Now, the cafeteria was doing good for the Davis brothers, but they were losing money on the bowling alley. Now, of course, Guilford Glazier knew that, so he just gave them a deal. He said, "I'll give you the rest of your contract's rent if you'll desegregate your restaurant." They did. Not only did they desegregate their restaurant, they were on the Southern Restaurant Association board, and they influenced that whole organization to consider desegregation and did desegregate all of their restaurants across the South. So that little airplane ride turned into a significant impetus to uh, have a good progression of desegregation among the Davis Brothers restaurants, of course. So the recognition of the 1955 desegregation, when I made this presentation to the high school, we were approaching the 65th anniversary. And it's great that we were doing that. The accomplishment of these 85 individuals is worthy of all the recognition we can give them. It's been too long in coming. And I was glad to see the Clinton 12 recognized a few years ago. That desegregation, although it did not go peacefully, it was a huge uh, mess and a lot of turmoil associated with it, unlike what happened in Oak Ridge. Oak Ridge did not have any violence or anything near what happened at the Clinton 12 or what happened in 57 in Little Rock. Oak Ridge's was quite calm and was recognized at the time by newspapers and Life magazine as being a desegregation effort that went smoothly. However, the public schools, uh, as elaborated in this particular publication, gives the definition for public schools. And the reason I point this out is that there's been some hesitation about claiming Oak Ridge was the first public school in the Southeast that desegregated. But I think it's fine that we can do that, and that is based on this definition that I find in those documents that I had the link for. It says public schools depend primarily on local, state, and federal government funds, while private schools are usually supported by tuition payments, sometimes by funds from other non-public sources. So Oak Ridge Schools was funded by federal government funds. So that makes it legitimate and appropriate to consider the schools in Oak Ridge as public schools. And I think there need not be any hesitation about claiming Oak Ridge was the first public schools in the Southeast to be desegregated. There were schools in the South that were desegregated prior to Oak Ridge. Some public schools in Arkansas were desegregated as early as 1954. But Oak Ridge would have been the first in the Southeast, if you consider the Southeast east of the Mississippi River. Thank you for watching this presentation.